In this chapter, we'll take a look at the biosocial development as it occurs in the phase of development known as emerging adulthood. So first of all, what does emerging adulthood mean? Well, usually it refers to the period between ages of 18 and 25 years of age. Usually that's thought of as a separate developmental stage. So let's move on here. And usually during, that time, usually, as long as the individual is, generally healthy and in a good physical state, they're usually in good health. So they are able to engage in, upon, things like, intense sports, hard work, childbearing, and so one thing that is notated down below is physical work and parenthood are no longer expected of every young adult in the 21st century. So you might want to pause and consider why that might be and maybe think of some examples or something. But moving on here. So definitely we'll take a look, at, the growth and strength type factors involved in this phase of development. And because of food availability, most, emerging adults, they've reached their full height. Usually girls, by the age of 16, boys by the age of 18. And definitely muscle growth and fat accumulation continue, into the early 20s. And one thing that is noted down here below, is death from disease. Usually occurs very rarely during this phase of development. Okay, so some of the protective functions that occur during this phase. And so I highly recommend, you definitely pause the video, become familiar with this material, and take notes. So the first phrase that we'll talk about is organ reserve, and that's the capacity of organs to allow the body to cope with stress, through, extra unused functioning ability. So the second phrase that you need to be familiar with or term is homeostasis. And so that just means, the adjustment of all the body systems to keep physiological functions in a state of equilibrium. So homeostasis, that means, that everything is working together to basically arrive at, an average state of wellness or ability. Okay, the last term on this slide right here is allostasis. And that just means, the body's, adjustment, affects overall physiology, but allostatic load, refers to the wear and tear on the body that results from either too much stress or inefficient management of stress. So definitely become aware of those and become familiar with those terms. Moving on. So we'll talk about here, the effects of sleep, too much or too little, things like that. A couple just very quick, little facts here, is, definitely, every emerging adult, sometimes sleeps too little and is tired the next day. And that's usually just means, homeostasis, or stasis, but I think I pronounce it homeostasis. And, but if that occurs, and that's okay, the body will, try to return to its normal state, which is the term homeostasis. But if, an individual experiences years, of, poor sleep habits, that can actually affect, lifespan, overall health, all kinds of things. And then, on the right-hand side of this here, feel free to look at, the effects of insufficient sleep. Okay, moving on. So This is just a very easy slide. Nothing to really to memorize on this, but most emerging adults, they tend to look vital, will have some attractiveness, that kind of thing. So also activity during this phase, is usually pretty good. Most individuals at this phase of development, they're engaged in some type of aerobic and muscle strengthening type exercise usually. And so here's some of the factors that encourage, activity, things like friendship, communities. And I put a little note right here, that, in the past, generations, they quit exercising when they got married or they became parents, or their career became more demanding. But usually, young adults today, aware of this tendency, they choose friends and communities that support them staying active rather than stop them from being active. So just something to think about. And let me know if that's true or not. That might be something worth discussing in our discussion forums or something. Okay, so in regard, keeping on, the discussion here about staying healthy, things like eating well. The term right here, set point, that just means a certain body weight that a person's homeostatic processes strive to maintain. Okay. And don't worry about body mass index. That's the ratio of a person's weight divided by their height. And, so, the thing is, I don't put a lot of, into that body mass index because, I was a personal trainer for many years and so, I weigh roughly 180 pounds, from my height, I'm about 5'10" and a half or so. But, I've always, been considered to be obese, even though I'm very lean, and have a lot of muscle and everything from exercise. So body mass index, I don't really, put a lot of, weight into, that kind of thing. But let me know if you've had experiences with that. Okay, now we'll just briefly talk about, sex during emerging adulthood, So sexual reproductive system is especially vigorous during this time period. So usually, that is determined by, peaked sex hormones. And, definitely the sex drive is powerful during this phase of development. So moving on, most babies are born to women under age 25. Marriage usually occurs, around age 20, et cetera, et cetera. That was historically, but today, it's a little different here. And so many emerging adults, they prefer, to use, birth control. And other things, if I may pause here, and just, add to this, but, definitely, financial concerns, for people these days, for younger people these days, are a little different than, than they were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So that might also be a factor in that type of, making those decisions. Now here's perceptions of premarital sex. This was a study done in 2017. I'm sorry, 2014. Sorry. But basically, you can just see that culturally speaking, that different cultures, different parts of the world, those in different parts of the world, they have different opinions and perceptions of premarital sex. As you can see, Europe has, the lowest percentage, whereas the Middle East has the higher percentage, of, thinking that premarital sex is wrong. So that might be something interesting to talk about in discussion forums as well. Okay, so we're going to change gears now and talk about, the emotional stress, that might be involved with sexual patterns and things, during this phase of development. So definitely, those can cause emotional stress as relationships, begin and end. I think most of us are aware of that dynamic. That's just a part of being a human, I think. So definitely, the influence, that can be things like religion and culture, religious beliefs, that can also affect, one's conceptions, about that this kind of topic. Okay, so let's fully change gears here and just to start discussing psychopathology. And so definitely, there are multiple stresses, of emerging adults, um, so definitely most emerging adults, they experience fewer stresses. Okay, self-esteem is higher, suicidal thoughts are less common. So do you believe that that's still true to this day? That's something that might be worth definitely discussing in our discussion forums as well. The term right here, diathesis, right here, that's a stress model. And that's the view that mental disorders, those are produced by the interaction of genetics and a stressful environment and life events. So all three of those things can work together to produce mental disorder. And that working, all those factors working together, that's called diathesis right here. Now, please make note, read, down below here, whenever I may put, I might put my own notes in here too, so feel free definitely to pause and read these. Okay, so diagnosed psychological disorders during this phase of development. So emerging adults, they experience more of every diagnosed psychological disorder than any of the older group. Now, why do you feel that that is? Here, we talk about things, like sexual freedom that might cause anxiety, depression, drug abuse, disease, remember these are just broad generalizations. These aren't, hard, fast rules, of course. But also just the fact that parents, are less involved, it's harder to get a steady job, what they call gainful employment here. And then, of course, here, my note right here that I added to this, that I just, want to remind you that, most serious disorders, they start in adolescence and grow worse in emerging adulthood. And many are comorbid and untreated. So, here's an example I put here. I'm not going to read this, but please just read through it on your own and, just become familiar with this. Okay, so carrying on from this conversation here, we're going to talk about depressive disorders. So usually before individuals reach 30 years of age, about 8% of individuals in the United States will suffer from major depressive disorder. Now, we tend to just call that depression, but psychologists, we have we have discerned that there are different types of depression, but overall general depression is known as major depressive disorder. And that is characterized by, these factors right here, like loss of interest, difficulties in sleeping, concentrating, eating, friendships, feeling hopeful, but it can also be biochemically rooted, so definitely, just as a result of dealing with these stressors in life and everything, the neurotransmitter levels in the brain may actually drop and actually, help cause the feeling of major depressive disorder in an individual. So that's what they mean by biochemically rooted. Now, the social cost of depression is higher than most physical illnesses, so definitely, that affects, if one is experiencing depression, that might affect one's education pursuits, educational pursuits, vocational choices, what jobs you choose, romantic commitments, employment, etc. So just be aware of that, and maybe think of your experience with that, or loved ones, or friends or something. Now, also, under the broad umbrella of what's called anxiety disorders, usually, those are shaped, by age and genetic vulnerability, so that can include things like panic attacks, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder, or what's known as OCD. And so definitely think about that, and think if you have any other more, you know, um, I guess, if you've experienced any of these, or, people have other examples you might have, maybe discuss that in our discussion forums. Okay. So definitely, switching gears here now. Also during this age, this phase of development. That's probably a more accurate term to use. But definitely emerging adulthood, is marked by a greater willingness to take various risks. So why do you think that is? Why do you think individuals are more willing to take risks? So you might think of biophysical development, like, what is going on in the brain, developmentally speaking, biophysically, is the brain, is the, like the prefrontal lobes of the brain, are they fully developed at this age, during this age group or this phase of development? Okay, so now we're going to talk briefly, about drug abuse during this phase, and so definitely, things, like, substance use disorders, SUDs, that is, usually refers to, ingestion of a drug, due to the extent that it impairs the user's biological or psychological well-being. So that's what's important to know right there. Okay. So definitely pause and, either become very familiar with that, or take some notes or something to help you remember that. And definitely pause the video and look at the rest here. But I'm going to move on here. So carrying on this conversation about drug abuse, we're also going to talk about alcohol and marijuana, which is the abuse of those is more common among college students than other emerging adults. In your experience, do you feel that that is true? Do you, people that and that it might be currently in college or something, is this true? Are these statistics true? Okay, so switching gears here, we're going to talk about social norms. So social norms, they are customs for usual behavior within a particular society. Okay, so that's what's important right there, is this right there. Okay, so they definitely, exert a strong influence on emerging adults. Even college students, social norms are very, important, and sometimes we take them for granted because we just grew up a certain way, and we're not even actually fully consciously aware of them, until maybe we become a little more educated or a little older or something like that. Okay, so that concludes our discussion at this point. As a reminder, the next step is to download the study guide for this chapter. Answer the questions to the best of your abilities, memory-wise, and then definitely use your textbook to help you answer any other questions that you can't find in this video. and we will talk to you in the next video.